So here we have a Matrix brand arm curl. Now I don't normally use machines for curls, not that I have anything against it in principle. I just typically do fine, or feel as though I do fine with dumbbells, but again, I'm all about knowing your options and knowing what kind of experiences you can get with different tools. So with this particular machine, we have, again, a cam over here. Obviously the axis is right here. I like that it's actually labeled. It says axis, so you have no excuse, right? It's easy to find. But let's take a look at what happens as we go through the range here. As you do the curl, what happens to this cable? The distance between it and the axis goes up significantly. Let's see if I can do that in a less sloppy way. Again. So it gets significantly farther away, right? You see there, it's in closer to the axis, and then it goes farther out because of the shape of that cam. Now, this is an interesting situation because when we're dealing with elbow flexors, again, you know, you've heard me talk about muscle length, about how when a muscle is extremely lengthened or extremely shortened, when it's at those extreme ends of its range or of its lengths, available lengths, the force will drop off. The maximal force is going to dissipate somewhat. The optimal contraction range is somewhere in the middle for every muscle to some degree. Exactly how small that cluster is or how flat the curve is depends on some of the qualities of the individual muscle. But when we're doing a curl, people think about biceps, and it's a bicep curl. The biceps are not the only muscles working, all right? There are other muscles that also contribute to elbow flexion, right? We've got the brachioradialis, we've got the brachialis. We've got muscles that don't cross the shoulder that also are involved in this. Now, why do I bring up the shoulder? The biceps, both heads of the biceps cross the shoulder joint. One attaches, well, I'm not going to get really specific, but they both attach to different spots. You could basically think of it, for the purposes of this video, different spots on the scapula or on the shoulder blade from the front side. But they cross the shoulder joint. That means that the length of those muscles will be affected by the position of shoulder flexion. So when you're on this pad, if you have this is your upper arm, your humerus would be, laying right here, and then your elbow would be somewhere around this edge of the pad, depending on how long your arms are and how you're sitting. And then you reach down here and grab this guy and do the curl, right? And I grab there, you're probably going to use the handles, but there's no law that says you couldn't, if you're doing just a one-handed movement, do it there. Whatever. The point being, you're going to be sitting in a certain amount of shoulder flexion just by being in this machine. And so that will somewhat shorten both heads of your biceps. But, so that's important to think about, is that you've shortened it somewhat, and then you're just shortening it even more. By the time you get to the end of the rep, by the time you look like this person in the picture here, your bicep is reasonably shortened. It's not fully shortened. He could continue to flex his shoulder. So if you pictured the upper arm here, could be vertical, depending on how much available shoulder flexion this person has. And then the elbow could flex on top of that. But the point is, there is some shortening there. But again, we have other muscles that are not affected by the position of shoulder flexion. So we have this handle down here, and again, the arm would be, the elbow would be extended down here. We would look like the green arm right there. And in that position, the elbow flexors that do not cross the shoulder joint, the ones that, for the purposes of this exercise, only cross the elbow, would be relatively lengthened. So if they're pretty lengthened, that means they're probably not at their strongest. So then, that would make sense then, for those muscles, for this cam to be shaped in such a way that the resistance starts off a little lighter and then it gets a little bit heavier as the exercise progresses, right? for that moment arm to get a little bit bigger. So it's kind of cumbersome to use this machine one-handed while holding the camera, but hopefully that explains a few things, and it's just another layer of considerations to take into account, is that you have a bunch of different muscles that may be at different lengths during a particular exercise. In many cases, you'll have, you know, one muscle that's biarticular, or a couple of muscles that are biarticular, that is, they cross a couple of joints, and others that are just single joint muscles. I mentioned in a previous video about knee extensions, where one of the quad muscles, the rectus femoris, is getting even more shortened because you're also hip flexed, and that's a muscle that is commonly considered a hip flexor, right? So it's going to be maybe shortening at a different rate, and it'll be in different relative positions than the other quads will, because the other quad muscles, the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius, do not cross the hip joint, and thus are only really being shortened by the knee extension, not by hip flexion. Anyway, that's a talk for another video as far as getting more in depth on that, but I hope that this was informative.